He wasn't meant to be heard, not in a storm like this, not beneath the roar of rain hammering asphalt and metal and memory. But somehow the sound slipped through, thin and trembling, a cry so small it shouldn't have survived the night. And yet it did, threading its way through the downpour until it found the one man who had already failed to save something once before. The road stretched empty under a sky split with distant lightning, headlights cutting a narrow path through sheets of water ash. Ethan Cole drove with both hands tied on the wheel, his jaw set, his eyes scanning, but not really seeing, because men like him don't just leave the battlefield behind. They carry it, folded into quiet places, into rainy nights like this where every sound feels like a memory trying to break through. The wipers drag back and forth in a steady rhythm. Thump, sweep, thump, like a pulse that refused to calm. And for a moment there was nothing but that. The hum of the engine, the soft hiss of tires on wet pavement, the world reduced to motion and noise and distance. Until it wasn't. Until something cut through it all, sharp and fragile and wrong. A sound that didn't belong to the storm, didn't belong to the road, didn't belong to anything that should still be alive out here. Ethan's grip tightened, just slightly, the kind of movement no one else would notice, not even him at first, because instinct doesn't ask permission. It just acts, and the sound came again, faint but unmistakable, a whimper carried on water and wind. And he told himself it was nothing, just the storm playing tricks, just loose metal or a branch scraping somewhere unseen. But the truth settled deeper than that, because he had heard a sound like that once before, years ago, in a place far from here, when everything smelled like dust and heat and fear, when someone had called out and he had been just a second too late. The truck rolled forward another 50 feet, maybe 100, the sound, fading behind him, swallowed again by rain. And that should have been the end of it. It should have disappeared like all the other things he couldn't change. But something in his chest refused to let go, a quiet pressure, building beneath bone and memory. And then his foot eased off the gas without him deciding to do it. The engine lowering its growl, the truck slowing until the world felt heavier somehow, as if the storm itself were watching. He exhaled, slow, controlled, the way training teaches you. But training doesn't prepare you for ghosts that sound like something still alive, and before he could talk himself out of it, before logic could win, he turned the wheel, tires hissing as he pulled onto the shoulder, headlights angling back toward the stretch of road he had just left behind. Rain struck harder now, drumming against the hood, sliding in restless streams across the windshield, distorting everything into shifting shapes. And for a moment he just sat there, engine idling, listening, waiting, because if the sound didn't come again, he could leave, he could drive on and pretend this never happened. But the silence stretched too long, thick and heavy, until he almost believed it, almost. Reached for the gear shift, and then it came, softer this time, weaker, but unmistakable, a fragile cry rising from somewhere low, somewhere near the edge of the road where water pooled and shadows gathered. Ethan's door opened before he fully thought it through. Cold rain cutting through his jacket instantly, soaking into fabric, into skin, into places that remembered worse, and he stepped out into it anyway. Boots hitting the ground with a dull splash, the smell of wet pavement and distant. Earth rising around him, sharp and real, anchoring him in the moment. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the rain in a narrow cone, catching drops midair like frozen sparks, and he moved slowly, scanning, listening, following the direction of that sound as it pulled him closer, step by step, towards something he still couldn't see. The ditch along the roadside had filled with runoff, dark water swirling around debris, leaves, scraps of trash carried from somewhere upstream. And there, half hidden beneath the edge of a broken drainage grate, something shifted, barely, just enough to catch the light. And then he saw it, not clearly at first, just a shape small, too still, pressed against the cold. Concrete, as if trying to disappear, and the sound came again, weaker now, a breath more than a cry, but alive, undeniably alive. Ethan stopped just for a second, the world narrowing to that single point in the rain, because he knew this moment, knew the weight of what came next, the choice between walking away and stepping in, between protecting what was left of himself and risking it again for something that might not make it anyway. And the storm didn't care, the road didn't care, but that small, fragile sound did, reaching up through the noise, through the years, through everything he had buried, and asking without words if this time would be different. He took one step closer, then another, the beam steady now, fixed on the trembling shape as it came into focus, and for the first time he could see the outline of a tiny body, soaked through, pressed against the cold, eyes barely open but still searching, as if it had been waiting for someone it didn't even know would come. And something inside Ethan shifted, quiet but irreversible, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself. It just happens, like a door opening in a place you thought was sealed. Before we begin, tell me, where witching from, drop your country in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The rain did not let up. It pressed harder, as if testing him, as if asking how far he was willing to go. And Ethan crouched slowly at the edge of the ditch, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. The beam of his flashlight steadied now despite the tremor in his fingers, because he had learned long ago that hesitation could cost more than action, and yet this did not feel like a mission. It felt quieter than that, heavier, like something personal he had not agreed to carry. The small body before him shifted again, barely, a fragile attempt at movement that seemed to drain everything it had left, and when Ethan reached out, the puppy did not pull away, did not growl, did not even flinch. It simply looked at him with eyes that were too aware for something so young, as if it had already decided that running was no longer an option. The water around it swirled slowly, rising just enough to brush against its side, and Ethan moved faster then, one hand sliding beneath the tiny frame, the other steadying its head, careful, controlled, the way you handle something that might break if you believe it will. And the moment he lifted it, he felt it, the unnatural lightness, the absence of strength where there should have been resistance, and something in his chest tightened without permission. The puppy made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a breath catching halfway out, and its head pressed weakly against his wrist, as if searching for warmth it could barely recognize, and Ethan brought it closer instinctively, tucking it against his jacket, shielding it from the rain with his body as he stood. The storm still raging around them, but somehow quieter now, as if the world had narrowed to just the space between his heartbeat and the faint, uneven rhythm beneath his hand. He turned toward the truck, steps measured but urgent, every instinct pulling him forward. And as he reached the door, he paused just long enough to glance down again, because there was something about the way the puppy held itself, something that did not match the randomness of being lost. And that was when he saw it more clearly. Faint marks along its neck, not fresh, not bleeding, but undeniable, the kind of imprint left by something that had once been too tight for too long, and the realization settled quietly, not as anger, not as judgment, but as a fact he could not ignore. He opened the passenger door and climbed in quickly, pulling the puppy inside with him, shutting out the worst of the storm, though the sound of it still filled the cab like distant thunder. And for a moment he just sat there, engine idling, breath steadying, hands hovering uncertainly, as if unsure what came next, because this was the part no training manual covered, the space between finding and saving, where everything depended on choices made in seconds. He reached for the small emergency blanket, tucked behind the seat, the one he carried out of habit more than expectation, and wrapped it gently around the puppy, careful not to press too hard, careful not to assume it could handle more than it showed. And as he did, the puppy's eyes flickered, focusing on him for a brief second before drifting again, and that small moment felt louder than anything the storm had thrown at him. "Stay with me," he said quietly, the words leaving him before he realized he had spoken. Not a command, not an order, just a request shaped by something deeper than discipline, and the puppy responded with the faintest movement, a slight shift beneath the blanket, as if acknowledging a voice it did not understand but somehow trusted. Ethan leaned back against the seat, one hand resting lightly against the small rise and fall beneath the fabric, counting without meaning to, measuring each breath, each pause, each fragile continuation. And the rhythm was wrong, too slow, too uneven, like something struggling to remember how to keep going. He reached over and turned the heater on, warm air beginning to fill the cab in soft waves, carrying with it the scent of damp fabric and something else, something faint and metallic that did not belong to the rain, and his eyes flicked down again, sharper now, searching for what he might have missed. There, just beneath the edge of the blanket, near the puppy's front leg, he noticed a small patch of fur pressed flat in a way that did not match the rest, and when he gently adjusted the fabric, careful not to disturb more than necessary, he saw it, a tiny mark, almost hidden, the kind you would overlook if you were not looking for it. But Ethan had spent enough years reading details others missed, and this one did not sit right. He exhaled slowly, tension settling into his shoulders as understanding began to take shape, not fully formed, not yet clear, but enough to know this was not just a matter of getting the puppy warm and safe. There was something else here, something that explained why it had not run, why it had not fought, why it had simply waited. Outside, the rain continued its steady assault, drumming against the roof, sliding down the windows in restless streams. But inside the truck, time felt suspended, stretched thin between what had already happened and what was about to, and Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel with one hand while the other remained where it was, anchored to that fragile, uncertain life beside him, because leaving now was no longer a question, only direction was. And as he shifted the truck into gear, his eyes lingered one last time on the small, quiet form wrapped in gray, and a single thought settled in, heavy and unspoken. This was not just a rescue, and whatever had been done to this animal was not finished yet. The truck moved forward slowly at first, tires cutting through shallow streams of water that had begun to gather along the road, each rotation sending a soft spray outward as the storm continued to press down on everything in sight. But inside the cab the world had narrowed to something quieter, something fragile, and Ethan kept one hand steady on the wheel while the other remained near the small bundle beside him, not touching constantly, just close enough to feel, to confirm that the faint rhythm beneath the blanket had not disappeared. The heater pushed warm air into the space, filling it gradually, chasing away the cold that clung to soaked fabric and skin, and with each passing second the puppy's breathing shifted slightly, still uneven, still weak, but no longer as distant as before, and Ethan noticed it without looking directly, the way trained awareness works, always tracking, always measuring, even when the eyes stay forward. The road ahead stretched into darkness, broken only by the reach of his headlights and the occasional flicker of distant lightning, and he ran through options in his mind, the nearest town, the late hour, the likelihood of any veterinary clinic being open, and then he remembered a place small, off the highway about 8 miles ahead, a 24-hour emergency clinic he had passed once before without needing, a place he had not expected to matter until now. He pressed the gas slightly, not reckless, just enough to close distance, and the engine responded with a low, steady hum that felt almost reassuring in contrast to the storm outside. Beside him, the puppy shifted again, a small movement beneath the blanket that drew his attention instantly, and when he glanced down, he saw the edge of one ear twitch, a subtle motion that would have meant nothing to most people, but here now, it felt like a signal, a quiet refusal to let go, and Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. "That is it," he murmured, voice low, steady, as if speaking too loudly might undo whatever fragile hold the animal had on consciousness. And for a moment, just a moment, the puppy's eyes opened again, not fully, just enough to reveal a glimmer of awareness, a flicker that caught the dim light inside the cab and held it. And then it faded, not gone, just withdrawn, like something retreating to gather strength. The rain intensified briefly, hammering against the roof in a sudden surge that blurred the windshield despite the constant motion of the wipers, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, focusing harder, pushing through the distortion as the turnoff approached, a narrow road branching off the main stretch, barely marked, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. But he saw it, turned into it, tires slipping just slightly before catching again, the truck adjusting to the uneven surface as gravel replaced pavement. The trees closed in on either side, tall and dark, their outlines shifting in the storm, and the beam of his headlights carved a narrow corridor through them, leading him forward into something quieter, more contained. And as the distance shortened, a faint glow appeared ahead, soft at first, then clearer. A small building with a single lit sign. Its light cutting through the rain like a promise that had not yet been broken. He pulled into the lot, gravel crunching under the tires as he brought the truck to a stop near the entrance. And for a second he did not move, not because he hesitated, but because he listened, one hand pressing lightly against the blanket again, feeling for that same fragile rhythm. And it was there, faint but present, still fighting, still holding. He nodded once, more to himself than anything else, and reached for the door handle, the cold air rushing. And again, as he stepped out, rain immediately reclaiming him, soaking through what little warmth he had regained. But he did not slow, did not shield himself, his focus fixed entirely on the small life he carried as he moved quickly toward the entrance, boots striking the ground with purpose. The door opened with a soft chime, a sound that felt almost out of place in the middle of the storm. And inside, the air was warmer, cleaner, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic in quiet order, and behind the counter a woman looked up, her expression shifting instantly from routine to concern as she took in the scene before her. The soaked jacket, the tight grip, the urgency that did not need to be explained. Ethan stepped forward without hesitation, placing the small, wrapped form gently onto the counter, careful, controlled, as if every movement still mattered. And when the blanket shifted just enough to reveal the puppy's face, still pale beneath damp fur, the woman's eyes softened but sharpened at the same time, trained to see what others might miss. "Please," Ethan said, his voice steady but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that did not ask lightly. "Just do not let it slip away." And as the woman reached forward, hands already moving with practiced precision, the puppy made the faintest sound again, almost too quiet to register. But it was there, and for the first time since the storm had pulled him off that road, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of something that had been missing for longer than he could remember. The woman moved quickly, but without panic, the kind of calm that comes from seeing too many fragile moments and learning how to carry them without breaking. And as she lifted the edge of the blanket fully, the light above the counter revealed more than Ethan had seen in the truck, subtle signs that spoke quietly but clearly to someone trained to read them. And her expression shifted just enough for him to notice. Not fear, not shock, but recognition, as if this small life had already told a story without words. "I need you to stay right here," she said gently, not as a command but as a boundary, and Ethan nodded once, stepping back half a pace, though his eyes never left the puppy as it was carefully transferred onto a stainless steel table just beyond the counter, the surface reflecting the overhead light in a cold, steady glow that contrasted with the warmth still lingering in his hands. The room beyond was quiet, not empty, but still filled with soft mechanical sounds and the faint hum of equipment that suggested readiness. And as the woman worked, her movements were precise, efficient, each action flowing into the next without hesitation, checking, adjusting, listening, her focus absolute. And Ethan stood at the threshold between spaces, neither inside nor outside, suspended, in that narrow place where waiting becomes its own kind of test. The puppy did not move at first, its small body resting where it had been placed, wrapped in gray. But then there was a slight shift, a tremor that passed through it like a ripple across still water, and the woman leaned closer, her hand hovering just above its chest, not pressing, just feeling, and Ethan saw the moment she caught something, a change so subtle it could have been missed, and her shoulders eased just slightly. "There is something here," she murmured, more to herself than to him, and those words settled in the air with a weight that felt larger than they should have, because they were not a promise, not yet, but they were not nothing either. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest loosening by degrees, though not fully releasing, because he had learned not to trust moments too early, not to believe in outcomes before they arrived. And still, he could not pull his attention away from the small form on that table, from the fragile rise and fall that seemed to fight against its own fading. The woman reached for a small device, placing it gently against the puppy's side, listening, waiting, and for a second the room seemed to hold its breath with her, The hum of the lights, the distant sound of rain against the windows, everything narrowing to that single point of contact, and then she nodded once, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. "Weak," she said quietly, "but not gone," and the words carried a kind of gravity that made Ethan straighten without realizing it, as if something inside him had been waiting for exactly that confirmation. He stepped forward slightly, just enough to close the distance without crossing into her space, and his voice, when it came, was lower than before, steadier, but edged with something he did not try to hide. "What does it need?" And it was not a question shaped by curiosity. It was one shaped by intent, by readiness to act if given direction. The woman glanced at him briefly, assessing not his appearance, not the uniform lines of his posture, but something deeper, something in the way he stood, the way he had carried the animal in, the way he had not looked away once, and whatever she saw there seemed to settle something for her as well. "Time," she replied first, then after a beat, "and something to hold on to," and as she said it, she adjusted the blanket slightly, exposing just enough for her hand to rest lightly against the puppy's side again, grounding, steady, present. The puppy responded, not with movement at first, but with a faint sound, softer than before, almost like a breath catching and releasing at the same time, and Ethan felt it before he processed it, a shift in the air, a change in the rhythm of the moment that pulled him closer without thinking, his hand lifting slightly as if drawn by something he could not name. "Go ahead," the woman said quietly, stepping back just enough to allow it, and Ethan reached forward slow, deliberate, placing his hand gently against the small, wrapped form, not pressing, just resting there, and the contact was immediate, a connection that felt both fragile and certain at once, as if something on the edge had found a reason to lean back instead of falling away. The puppy's breathing shifted again, just slightly, but enough for him to notice, enough for the woman to glance at the monitor beside her and nod once more. And outside, the storm continued its steady rhythm, rain against glass, wind through trees, but inside that room, something quieter had taken hold, something that did not announce itself loudly, did not demand attention. It simply existed, growing. In the space between a man who had once been too late and a life that, for reasons neither of them understood yet, had chosen to wait. The contact did not feel like much at first, just a faint warmth of something barely holding on, but then it changed, subtle and slow, like a distant signal growing clearer, and Ethan felt it before he saw it. The rhythm beneath his palm shifting from scattered to something closer to steady, not strong, not safe, but present in a way that made the air in the room feel different. The woman watched closely, her eyes moving between the small body and the monitor beside her, reading numbers, patterns, changes too small for anyone untrained to notice, and she did. Not interrupt, did not rush, because there are moments where doing less is the only way forward, and this was one of them. Ethan kept his hand exactly where it was, unmoving, steady, as if any shift might break whatever fragile thread had formed, and his breathing slowed to match the rise and fall beneath his touch, instinctively sinking, grounding, offering something wordless that could not be measured by any machine in the room. The puppy responded again, this time with a slight movement of its head beneath the blanket, a weak attempt but intentional, and a faint sound followed, softer than anything before, but different, no longer just a cry, something closer to a response, and the woman exhaled quietly, a small release of tension that had been held just out of sight. "It is trying," she said under her breath, not loud enough to break the moment, just enough to acknowledge it, and Ethan nodded without looking up, because he could feel it. He did not need confirmation. The shift was real, it was happening, and for the first time since he had stepped into the storm, something inside him allowed a fraction of belief to surface. But belief, he knew, was dangerous when it came too early, and as if the moment itself understood that, the rhythm faltered, not completely, not gone, but uneven again, a stumble in the fragile pattern that pulled his focus tighter, his hand pressing just slightly more firmly, not forceful, just present, anchoring, refusing to let the connection slip, stay, he murmured, the word quiet, almost lost in the hum of the room, but it carried weight, not as a command, but as a promise, and the puppy's body responded with another small shift, a tremor, that passed through it like a signal returning from a distance. The woman moved then, adjusting something just out of his view, her actions careful, minimal, supporting without overwhelming, and the monitor beside her reflected the change in subtle increments. Numbers rising just enough to suggest movement in the right direction, though still far from safe. Outside, the storm continued its steady rhythm. Rain striking the windows in waves, wind pressing against the building as if testing its resolve, but inside, the space had narrowed further, reduced to breath, touch, and time, each second stretching longer than it should, each movement carrying more meaning than it ought to. Ethan's mind flickered briefly, not fully in a memory, but close enough to feel its edge, the echo of another moment where time had slowed and something fragile had slipped away despite everything he had done, and the thought pressed in, sharp and unwelcome. But he did not let it take hold, not this time, not here, because this was different. It had to be, and he tightened his focus, grounding himself in the present, in the warmth beneath his hand, in the faint but undeniable persistence of life that refused to fade. The puppy's breathing steadied again, just slightly, enough to create a pattern that could be followed, enough for the woman to glance at Ethan with something new in her expression. Not certainty, not relief, but a cautious acknowledgement that this was no longer slipping in the same direction it had been before. "It is holding," she said softly, and the words carried more weight than any declaration could have, because holding meant possibility, meant time, meant that whatever had been lost might not be entirely beyond reach. Ethan swallowed once, the movement small but deliberate, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than before, steadier. "Then we keep it there." And it was not a question, not a suggestion. It was a decision shaped by everything he had carried into that room. The puppy shifted again, this time turning its head just enough that its face became partially visible beneath the edge of the blanket, its eyes barely open but focused in a way that suggested awareness returning in fragments. And for a brief second, those eyes met his, not fully, not clearly, but enough to create a connection that did not need explanation. And then, just as quickly, the movement stilled again, not gone, but resting, conserving, holding on in the quietest way possible, and the room seemed to exhale around it, tension easing by degrees, though not disappearing entirely. Because this was not over, not yet. It had only just begun to turn, and whether it would continue in that direction remained uncertain, balanced on a line too thin to see but impossible to ignore. Time did not move the same way inside that room anymore. It stretched and folded around each breath, each flicker of movement, and Ethan remained where he was, hands steady, eyes fixed, as if shifting even an inch would undo the fragile balance they had managed to find, and the puppy's breathing, though still uneven, began to settle into something that could almost be called a rhythm, not strong, not certain, but no longer slipping away with every second. The woman adjusted the light above the table, softening it just enough to ease the strain on the small, sensitive eyes beneath the blanket, and she worked in quiet coordination with the moment rather than against it, adding warmth, adjusting position, offering support without interruption, and Ethan noticed how everything she did seemed to follow the same rule he was holding on to: do not force, do not rush, just stay. The monitor beside them continued its quiet reporting, numbers rising and falling in subtle waves, and though they remained far from stable, there was a pattern forming, something that repeated just enough to suggest that the body beneath his hand was beginning to remember how to continue. Ethan's jaw tightened briefly as a memory brushed too close to the surface. Not a full image, not a complete scene, just the echo of another moment where numbers had not risen, where patterns had not returned, where silence had followed despite every effort. And the weight of that past pressed in, heavy and familiar, but he did not let it take hold. He shifted his focus back to the present, to the warmth beneath his palm, to the faint but persistent rise and fall that refused to disappear. "You are still here," he said quietly, not expecting a response, not asking for one, just stating a truth he needed to hear as much as the small life in front of him did. And the puppy's ear twitched again, a slight movement that seemed almost deliberate now, as if something inside it was beginning to recognize more than just survival. The woman glanced at him briefly, her expression softer than before, less guarded, as if she had seen enough to understand that this was no longer just a case. It was something shared, something unfolding between two lives that had intersected at exactly the moment they needed to. She reached for a small cloth, gently drying the fur that still held traces of the storm, each motion careful, respectful of the fragility beneath. And as she worked, the puppy made another sound, faint but clearer this time, a soft exhale that carried a hint of effort rather than surrender. And Ethan felt like a shift in pressure, like something inside the room had tilted just slightly toward hope. "That is good," she murmured almost to herself, but the words settled between them, anchoring the moment in something tangible, something that could be held onto without breaking it. Ethan's hand remained steady, but his fingers adjusted slightly, not pressing, just aligning with the movement beneath, and for a brief second, the puppy leaned into it, barely noticeable, a fraction of an inch. At most, but intentional, and that small gesture carried more weight than anything else that had happened so far, because it was not just survival, it was response. Outside, the storm began to shift, not ending, not yet, but softening at the edges, the rain less violent against the windows, the wind losing some of its force, and the change was subtle, almost unnoticeable unless you were listening for it, but inside the room, it felt like a reflection of something deeper, a quiet easing that matched the fragile progress unfolding on the table. Ethan allowed himself a single breath that went deeper than the ones before, not a release, not fully, but enough to acknowledge that this moment had moved, past where it had been, and that mattered. Even if the outcome was still uncertain, the puppy's eyes opened again, a little wider this time, not fully aware, not yet, but present enough to catch the light, and for a second they seemed to focus, not on the room, not on the movement around it, but on the space directly in front, where Ethan stood, where his hand remained, where something steady and unyielding had been offered without condition. And then, as if the effort had taken everything it had left, the eyes closed again, not in retreat but in rest, a different kind of stillness than before, one that suggested holding rather than slipping, and the room settled into that quiet once more, the kind that does not demand attention. It simply asks for patience, for presence, for the willingness to stay until whatever is fighting beneath the surface decides it is ready to rise. The stillness did not mean safety. Ethan knew that much. It only meant a pause, a fragile space where everything could either strengthen or slip without warning. And he stayed exactly where he was, his hand still resting lightly against the small body, feeling for every shift, every signal that the quiet was holding for the right reasons. The puppy's breathing remained soft, but more consistent now, each rise and fall forming a pattern that repeated just enough to build trust in it. And that repetition became something to hold onto, something that kept the moment from unraveling. The woman moved carefully along the side of the table, checking small details with practiced precision, her fingers adjusting the position of the blanket, ensuring warmth stayed where it was needed, her eyes flicking to the monitor and back again, reading the subtle changes that continued to unfold. And for the first time since Ethan had entered the room, there was a shift in her posture, a quiet easing, that suggested this was no longer only a fight against time. It was becoming something more stable. "It is responding," she said softly, her voice carrying a calm certainty that had not been there before, and Ethan nodded slightly, though he did not look away, because he could feel it. The difference was no longer hidden in numbers or observations. It was present beneath his hand, in the way the small chest rose a little stronger, in the way the pauses between breaths shortened just enough to matter. He adjusted his stance slightly, not moving away, just grounding himself more firmly, as if preparing to stay longer than he had expected. And as he did, The puppy made another sound, faint but clearer now, a soft whine that carried something new within it, not just need, but awareness and the moment it reached his ears. Something inside him shifted again, deeper this time, less guarded, more certain. "That is it," he said quietly, not as encouragement, but as recognition, as if naming the moment would help it remain. The puppy's head moved again, a small turn beneath the blanket, and for a brief second its nose pressed lightly against his fingers, the contact barely there, but intentional, unmistakable. And Ethan felt it as more than touch. It was a response, a connection forming where there had only been survival before. The woman paused, watching the interaction with a thoughtful expression, and then she stepped back just slightly, giving space without withdrawing support, allowing whatever was unfolding between them to continue without interruption. Outside, the rain softened further, no longer striking the windows with force, now falling in a steady, quieter rhythm, and the sound shifted from urgency to something almost reflective, as if the storm itself had begun to settle into a different kind of presence. Inside, the light remained steady, the air warm, the quiet filled with the soft cadence of breathing that had not existed when the night began. Ethan's mind drifted for a moment, not into the past fully, but close enough to feel its edges again, the memory of a hand he had once held that had grown still despite everything, the weight of that moment lingering in places he could not reach. And for a second, doubt pressed in, sharp and familiar, asking the same question it always did, whether this would end the same way, whether he was only delaying the inevitable. But the answer did not come from thought. It came from the present, from the small, steady movement beneath his hand, from the way the puppy leaned again, slightly stronger this time, from the quiet persistence that refused to mirror the past, and he let that answer settle where the doubt had been. "Not this time," he murmured, the words barely audible, but firm, not a plea, not a hope, a decision. The puppy's breathing deepened just slightly, enough to shift the rhythm into something closer to normal, and the monitor reflected it with small but consistent changes, numbers rising in a pattern that no longer wavered with each second, and the woman allowed herself a single nod, subtle but meaningful, acknowledging what was happening without overstating it. "It is stabilizing," she said, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, no caution wrapped around the words, just a quiet certainty that the line they had been balancing on had begun to widen into something more secure. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing in a way that had nothing to do with comfort, and everything to do with release, not complete, not final, but enough to recognize that the moment had turned, that something fragile had chosen to stay. The puppy shifted once more, its eyes opening again, clearer now, focusing for a fraction longer than before, and when they met his, there was no fear in them, no confusion, just a quiet, steady presence that seemed to acknowledge him in a way that words could not capture. And then the eyes closed again, not from weakness, but from rest. A different kind of stillness, one that carried the promise of waking again. And in that quiet, steady room, with the storm fading beyond the walls and the fragile rhythm holding strong, Ethan remained where he was, hands still, presence unwavering, knowing without needing to say it that whatever had begun here was not just about saving a life. It was about something finding its way back, something that had been lost for longer than either of them could understand. The room settled into a quieter rhythm after that, not silent, but steady, the kind of stillness that follows something fragile choosing to remain, and Ethan did not move right away, not because he needed to stay, but because leaving too soon felt like breaking something that had only just begun to form. The puppy rested beneath his hand, its breathing no longer uneven but soft and consistent, each rise and fall carrying a quiet strength that had not been there before, and the warmth that radiated through the blanket felt different now, less like something fading and more like something returning. The woman adjusted a final setting on the monitor, her movements no longer urgent, her expression calm in a way that came from certainty rather than hope. And when she stepped back, she allowed herself a small exhale, the kind that releases a held breath without drawing attention to it. "It is going to need rest," she said gently, her voice softer now that the edge of the moment had passed. But it made it through the worst part, and Ethan nodded once, the words settling into him slowly, not as relief, not yet, but as something he could finally begin to accept. He withdrew his hand carefully, not abruptly, just enough to break contact without disrupting the rhythm beneath. And for a brief second, the puppy shifted again, its nose following the absence, a small, searching movement that stopped just short of reaching, as if recognizing the space but not needing to fill it completely. Ethan noticed, of course he did, and something in his chest responded quietly, a pull he did not question, but he did not return his hand, not yet, because part of him understood that this moment was not about holding on anymore. It was about allowing the small life in front of him to stand on its own fragile ground. The woman covered the puppy more fully with the blanket, ensuring warmth remained steady, her hands moving with care that suggested both experience and respect. And as she finished, she looked at Ethan again, her expression thoughtful, measuring something unspoken. "You can stay if you want," she said, not as an offer of obligation, but as an acknowledgement of what had already passed between him and the animal. And Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but because the question touched something deeper than the moment itself. Outside, the rain had softened into a gentle, steady fall, no longer aggressive, no longer demanding, and the sound it made against the windows carried a different tone now, less like a warning and more like a presence that had settled into the background. Ethan glanced toward the door briefly, the world beyond still waiting, still moving forward as it always did, and then he looked back at the small form on the table, at the quiet rise and fall that had not existed an hour ago, at the life that had held on without knowing why. "I will stay a little longer," he said finally, his voice low but certain, and the woman nodded, as if she had expected that answer, as if the decision had already been made long before he spoke it. Time passed in small increments after that, minutes that stretched into something softer, less tense, and the puppy remained still but not empty, resting in a way that suggested recovery rather than retreat, and every so often there would be a slight movement, a shift of its paw, a twitch of its ear, small signs. That life was no longer just holding on, it was beginning to return. Ethan sat down in a chair near the table. Not too close, not too far, his posture relaxed in a way that had not come easily, and he watched without staring, present without pressing, allowing the moment to exist without trying to control it. The woman moved quietly in the background, checking instruments, making notes, her presence steady but unobtrusive, and the room carried a balance that had not been there before, a quiet agreement between effort and rest. At one point, the puppy's eyes opened again, clearer this time, focusing longer, and though its gaze was still unfixed, still searching, there was something different in it, something that suggested it was no longer drifting between states. It was beginning to choose where to remain. Ethan noticed, of course he did, and though he did not move, did not speak, something in his expression softened. A shift so small it would have been easy to miss, but it was. There, the kind of change that does not come from relief, but from recognition. The storm outside continued to fade, the rain now a quiet whisper against the glass, and the night that had begun with urgency and uncertainty had settled into something else entirely, something slower, something steadier. And in that quiet shared space between a man who had once been too late and a small life that had chosen not to slip away, something unspoken had taken root, not loud, not dramatic, just present, waiting to see what it might become. Morning did not arrive all at once. It eased its way in slowly, first through the soft gray light that replaced the darkness beyond the windows, then through the quiet shift in the air as the storm finally released its hold, leaving behind only the faint scent of rain and the gentle drip of water from unseen edges. Inside the room, the lights had not changed. The steady glow remained the same, but something in the atmosphere felt different, lighter in a way that did not need to be explained. And Ethan, who had not realized how long he had been sitting there, became aware of the passage of time only when the silence settled deeper, no longer tense, no longer waiting for something to go wrong. The puppy rested where it had been placed, wrapped and warm, its breathing now even, unforced, each rise and fall steady enough to no longer draw constant attention. And that, more than anything, was what finally allowed Ethan to shift slightly in his chair, his body acknowledging what his mind had been holding back. The woman moved quietly across the room, checking one last time, her hands gentle, her expression calm in a way that carried quiet assurance. And when she looked at Ethan, there was no urgency left in her gaze, only a simple understanding. "It is going to be all right," she said, not as a prediction, not as a promise she could not guarantee, but as a recognition of what had already changed. And Ethan nodded, slowly, the words settling into him with a weight that did not press down, but instead lifted something he had been carrying for far too long. He stood then, not abruptly, just enough to feel the ground beneath him again, and he stepped closer to the table, his eyes resting on the small form that had pulled him out of the night and into this moment. And for a second he did not reach out. He simply looked, taking in the quiet strength that had replaced the fragile uncertainty from before. The puppy stirred slightly, as if sensing the shift, its head moving just enough to acknowledge the presence nearby, and its eyes opened once more, clearer now, not searching, not drifting, but present. And when they met his, there was no hesitation, no fear, just a calm recognition that needed no explanation. Ethan exhaled softly, a breath that carried something close to relief, but deeper than that, something steadier. And this time, when he placed his hand gently against the small, warm body, the response came immediately, not weak, not uncertain, but real, a quiet leaning into the contact that spoke of trust forming where there had been none. Outside, the last drops of rain fell from the edges of the roof, slow and steady. The storm now, nothing more than a memory, carried in the scent of the air and the dampness of the ground. And the world beyond the clinic had begun to move again, cars passing in the distance, the faint sound of early morning life returning. But inside, the moment held, unchanged by anything outside its walls. Ethan remained there for a few seconds longer, his hand still, his presence steady. And then he stepped back, not because he needed to leave, but because he understood that staying was no longer about holding something together. It was about allowing it to continue without him. The woman approached, adjusting the blanket one last time, her movements careful but relaxed, and she glanced at Ethan with a small nod that carried both gratitude and respect, the kind share between people who had witnessed something fragile choose to remain. Ethan returned the nod, equally quiet, and then he turned toward the door, each step measured, unhurried, as if leaving this space required a different kind of awareness than entering it had. He paused just before reaching it, not turning back immediately, just standing there for a second, listening to the quiet, to the steady breathing behind him, to the absence of urgency that had filled the room before. And when he did look back, it was not with concern, not with doubt, but with something softer, something that did not need to hold on anymore. The puppy had already settled again, resting in the kind of stillness that comes from safety rather than exhaustion, and the woman moved beside it with the same calm rhythm that had carried them through the night. And Ethan took that in, not as an ending, but as a continuation he no longer needed to control. He stepped outside then, the cool morning air meeting him gently, the sky beginning to lighten above the horizon, and the world felt wider than it had before, not because anything had changed out there, but because something inside him had. He walked toward his truck, the sound of water dripping from the trees surrounding the lot marking each step, and as he reached the door he paused once more, looking out across the quiet road that had brought him here, the place where the night had shifted without warning, where something small had called out and been heard. And for a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to stand in that space between what had been and what would come next, understanding in a way that did not need words that not everything that is lost is meant to stay that way, and not everything that is saved is meant to be kept. Some things simply arrive long enough to remind you that you are still capable of choosing differently, that even in the quietest moments, something can return, not with force, not with certainty, but with enough to begin again. And Ethan carried that with him as he opened the truck door and stepped into the day, leaving behind not an ending, but something that had found its way forward without needing to be held. In this deeply emotional and cinematic journey, a U.S. Marine driving through a relentless storm hears a faint cry that changes everything. What begins as a passing moment becomes a powerful act of compassion when the Marine discovers a fragile German Shepherd puppy struggling to survive beneath the rain, leading to a race against time that unfolds with quiet intensity and human vulnerability. As one of the most moving animal stories, this narrative captures the unspoken bond between a soldier, shaped by past loss, and a helpless creature on the edge of fading away, where every breath, every decision, and every second carries weight. Inside a small emergency clinic, the tension builds not through action, but through presence, as the Marine refuses to let go while a dedicated veterinarian works with calm precision, revealing how animal stories like this are not about spectacle, but about resilience, trust, and the silent ways life holds on. As the puppy begins to respond, the story evolves into something deeper, showing how healing does not arrive loudly, but in quiet shifts, in small movements, in the courage to stay when leaving would be easier, making this one of those rare animal stories that resonate beyond the moment. Through subtle emotional layers, the Marine confronts a past he could not change, and in doing so, finds a chance to choose differently, proving that sometimes redemption does not come from grand gestures, but from simply being present when it matters most, a theme that defines the heart of unforgettable animal stories. As the storm fades and morning light replaces darkness, the connection between the Marine and the German Shepherd puppy remains unspoken yet undeniable, leaving behind a lasting impression that some encounters are not meant to be held onto, but to remind us of who we are capable of becoming, and why stories like these continue to define the very essence of powerful animal stories. Character 1. White American U.S. Marine, mid-30s, rugged face, short military haircut, light stubble, green-gray eyes, wearing soaked tactical jacket, dog tags, front view, realistic, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, cinematic lighting, rain-soaked atmosphere, serious expression. Authentic character 2, young German Shepherd puppy, about 8 weeks old, sable black and tan coat, wet fur, full body visible, standing weak but alert, front view, realistic anatomy. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, cinematic lighting, rain-soaked ground, vulnerable expression 1, a dimly lit emergency veterinary clinic interior at night. Warm overhead surgical lights reflecting softly on stainless steel surfaces. A white U.S. Marine in his mid-30s with short military haircut and light stubble stands close to a table, his soaked jacket still clinging to him. 1. Steady hand gently resting on a fragile German Shepherd puppy wrapped in a gray blanket. The puppy is small, about 8 weeks old, sable black and tan coat still damp. Lying weak but breathing, eyes barely open with a vulnerable expression. A calm veterinarian stands nearby adjusting equipment, focused but gentle. Rain streaks down the window in the background, creating cinematic reflections. The Marine's face shows controlled concern and quiet determination, posture grounded and protective. The atmosphere is tense but filled with hope, cinematic lighting, realistic detail, emotional stillness, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 2 early morning outside a roadside American diner. Soft golden sunlight cutting through the scene. A white U.S. Marine in his mid-30s sits alone at a small outdoor table holding a cup of black coffee, wearing casual clothes with dog tags visible against his chest. His posture slightly forward, shoulders tense but composed, eyes distant as if carrying memories. The German Shepherd puppy, now cleaner but still small, rests near his boots on the ground, looking up with quiet curiosity and soft alert eyes. Passing cars blur gently in the background, steam rising from the coffee cup. The Marine's expression is thoughtful and restrained, hinting at emotional depth without exaggeration. The puppy's presence adds subtle warmth to the otherwise solitary scene. Cinematic realism, natural lighting, grounded American environment, no cartoon. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1, 2, 3. A quiet suburban backyard under soft daylight. Green grass, slightly damp. A young German Shepherd puppy around 8 weeks old stands unsteadily but alert, full body visible. Sable black and tan coat clean, but slightly fluffy. Ears partially upright, eyes wide and curious. The white U.S. Marine stands in the background watching calmly, with a softened expression. Hands relaxed at his sides, posture less rigid than before. The puppy takes small steps forward, exploring the environment. Sunlight filtering through trees, creating gentle shadows. The Marine's presence is quiet and observant, not intrusive, suggesting trust building. The scene feels peaceful and grounded, emphasizing innocence and recovery. Realistic textures, natural environment, emotional subtlety, cinematic composition. No cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1, 2, for a dramatic rain-soaked roadside at night. Heavy rain falling under harsh headlights from a parked truck. The white U.S. Marine kneels on wet pavement near a drainage ditch, reaching carefully toward a tiny German Shepherd puppy partially hidden among debris. The puppy appears weak and soaked, body low and trembling slightly. In the background, a vague silhouette of an abandoned vehicle creates tension without explicit threat. Lightning faintly illuminates the sky. The Marine's face shows urgency and focus, eyes locked on the puppy, one knee pressed into the water as rain splashes around him. The moment is intense but controlled, emphasizing rescue and choice. Cinematic rain, strong contrast lighting, realistic environment. No cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1, 2, 5. Inside a moving truck at night. Dashboard lights casting a soft glow across the cabin. Rain hitting the windshield as wipers sweep rhythmically. The white U.S. Marine drives with focused intensity, one hand on the steering wheel and the other occasionally reaching toward the passenger seat, where the German Shepherd puppy lies wrapped in a blanket. The puppy is still weak but breathing, eyes half open. The Marine's face shows concentration and urgency without panic. Jaw slightly tense, eyes forward but aware. Reflections of passing streetlights flicker across the glass. The confined space enhances emotional pressure while remaining realistic. Cinematic framing, soft interior lighting, grounded detail. No cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1, 2, 6. Interior veterinary clinic under clean medical lighting. The German Shepherd puppy lies on a table partially uncovered, small body visible. Breathing fragile but present. The white U.S. Marine stands nearby, posture upright but tense, watching every movement closely. A veterinarian leans in with precise attention, hands carefully positioned, face calm and professional. Medical equipment softly lit in the background, subtle reflections on metal surfaces. The Marine's expression reveals controlled worry and quiet hope. The puppy's eyes flicker slightly, showing early response. The environment is sterile yet emotionally charged. Cinematic realism, subtle tension, detailed lighting. No cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1, 2, 7. Close cinematic focus on the Marine's hand gently resting on the German Shepherd puppy's chest. Fingers steady and careful. The puppy's small body rises faintly beneath his touch, subtle breathing. Visible. The Marine's face partially visible in soft blur behind. Expression intense but quiet. Lighting is warm and focused, highlighting texture of fur and skin. The puppy's eyes slightly open with weak but responsive expression. Background softly blurred to emphasize connection. Emotional intimacy without exaggeration. Highly realistic detail. Cinematic depth of field. No cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1, 2, 8. Wider view of the veterinary clinic as tension eases. Rain outside, softer against windows. Light inside warmer and calmer. The white U.S. Marine sits in a chair nearby, posture more relaxed but still attentive. watching the German Shepherd puppy resting steadily on the table. The puppy appears more stable, breathing consistent, body no longer rigid. The veterinarian moves quietly in the background. No urgency in motion. The atmosphere shifts toward calm recovery. Reflections of rain create gentle patterns on glass. Cinematic lighting, emotional transition. Grounded realism. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. 1-2-9 interior clinic near a window at early dawn. Soft blue-gray light entering. The white U.S. Marine stands looking outside at fading rain, silhouette partially outlined by natural light. Behind him, slightly out of focus, the German Shepherd puppy rests safely on the table. The Marine's posture is upright but calm, shoulders less tense, expression reflective and thoughtful. The window shows rain slowing, world becoming quieter. The scene emphasizes internal change rather than action. Cinematic framing, soft contrast lighting, emotional stillness. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. 1-10 close scene of the German Shepherd puppy resting under a blanket. Fur drying, body relaxed, ears twitching slightly, eyes open briefly showing alertness and calm awareness. The white U.S. Marine stands nearby, watching quietly. Expression softened, no longer tense. Warm light highlights the puppy's face and subtle movements. The environment feels safe and stable. The Marine's presence is gentle, not imposing. Cinematic focus on recovery and life returning. Realistic textures, soft lighting, emotional clarity. No cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1-11 The white U.S. Marine stand beside the veterinary table. Not touching the puppy now, simply observing with quiet respect. The German Shepherd puppy rests comfortably, breathing steady, body relaxed. The veterinarian is present but distant in the background. The Marine's expression shows calm acceptance and quiet connection. Lighting is soft and balanced, no harsh shadows. The atmosphere is peaceful and grounded. The distance between man and dog symbolizes trust and independence. Cinematic composition, realistic environment, emotional subtlety. No cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1-2-12 Early morning outside the clinic. Rain has stopped, pavement wet and reflecting soft sunrise tones. The white U.S. Marine walks toward his truck, posture calm and steady, glancing back briefly toward the clinic, through the glass door. Faintly visible, the German Shepherd puppy rests safely inside. The Marine's expression is thoughtful and peaceful, not dramatic. Trees and sky show fresh post-rain clarity. The scene feels open-ended and reflective. Cinematic natural lighting, soft color tones, grounded realism, emotional closure without finality. No cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1-2